Welcome to the Real Paranormal Stories podcast with your host, Christopher Buckner. Send your stories to realparanormalstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Royalty-free music provided by Kevin MacLeod and Tabletop Audio. And now, let's take a trip into the paranormal. This story comes from Reddit user Alexander_BC. And this is their story. When I was younger, I used to live next to this very old and run-down church. This church was one of the town's original buildings from the late 1800s. It had been remodeled a few times, but mostly the building had maintained its original design. It was a large, square, white, plaster-sided building, with a very short bell tower capping the top of the roof. The church had gone through several owners for various reasons, and had also been used for several purposes while I was growing up. When I was very young, it was basically abandoned, and kids would sometimes play in it. I never really liked being in that church. It just made me feel uncomfortable. So I would rarely go into the church even when other kids were there. At some point it became a night school. The teenagers that had to attend the school would say they would see spooky things out of the corner of their eyes, or hear strange sounds when no one was talking. Very shortly after becoming a night school, they moved the school to another building. They said it was because they needed more space, but all the teens joked that it was because the teachers were frightened of the building. After being empty for another year or so, it was rented out to a family who turned it into their house. The family was lower middle class just like my family, and they rented it because it was cheap. Their living room was basically the bottom floor of the building, since the church hadn't been remodeled into a proper house. It was just being used as one. Even then, I didn't really like that church. It was directly attached to our yard, and I wouldn't get too close to it at night because it creeped me out. Despite the creepy church house, our families became fairly close in the short time they lived there, and my mom would babysit their infant for them pretty often. I was around 13 at the time and was friends with the two other kids who lived in the church. They would tell me they thought the church was a little creepy at night too, but nothing really interesting had happened to them. One night, my younger sister got scared of something and woke me up. She said she heard something weird outside her window and wanted me to check it out for her. Her bedroom window is on the second floor and faces the church. Now, I am not super keen on doing this, but I feel like I have to, so I do it anyway. I get to her window and look outside. To my relief, I don't see anything of interest. No marks on the window, nothing outside in the yard, and no cliched branches rubbing on the window. I begin to tell her it's fine when we both hear what sounds like a baby crying in the distance. I realize it must be the neighbor's baby and tell her not to worry about it. I just think to myself that their baby must be incredibly loud for us to hear it over here. I take another look out the window to see a woman in a red dress walking by the church window, cradling what must have been the baby. I get chills down my spine and look away quickly. I assume it was my neighbor's mom and decide it's time to go back to bed. A few months later, it's the neighbor's turn to babysit us for my mom. My sister and I have to stay the night in the creepy church with our neighbors. The neighbor kids showed us around their house to make sure we knew where everything was. The two kids' bedrooms were upstairs next to the nursery they set up for the baby. Mom and Dad's room was downstairs because it was the biggest bedroom. The kitchen and bathroom were downstairs and attached to the living room. It was an interesting layout for a house, but it was obviously still just a church with a living room set up in the main hall. We spent most of the night watching movies and cartoons, and were successfully distracted for the majority of the evening. Eventually, it was bedtime, so we rolled out our sleeping bags and went to sleep in the living room. At some point in the night, we were all woken up by the baby crying from upstairs. It was annoyingly loud. We hoped the baby would just stop on its own, but after waiting for a while, the neighbor kid decided it was time to wake up their parents. The mom came out of their room wondering what was wrong, and we told her the baby was crying. She looked really confused and listened quietly for a moment and obviously heard the baby crying. She then turned around and woke up her husband and said something to him in a frightened tone. It was dark, so we couldn't see much into their bedroom, but after a moment, she came out of their bedroom holding their sleeping baby. The crying baby sounds continued. Her husband comes out of their bedroom holding a broom like a baseball bat and tells us all to stay downstairs. We are all terrified and go into the living room to sit on the couch and wait for him to come back. As he climbs the squeaking stairs, we can still hear the baby crying, while their baby is still fast asleep. Suddenly, the crying stops. You can hear the husband walking around on the old floorboards, creaking with every step. He yells, "Come out or I'll call the police." No response. After a while of creaking floorboards, he comes back downstairs and shrugs his shoulders. "Probably an injured animal or something. Must have scared it away," he says. Despite that, we all spent the rest of the evening by the couch together. They moved away shortly after, and the church remained uninhabited for several years after that. A few years after the baby incident, I became friends with someone who had moved into the house across the street from the church after I had moved away. When I learned he had lived across the street from where I used to live, I told him how I always hated that church. He agreed, and before I could tell him my story, he told me one of his own. He told me that he had once been getting home late when he thought he heard someone yelling in the distance. He wasn't able to make out any words, but he was sure he heard someone yelling something from far away. He started looking around when he spotted a woman in a red dress circling inside the bell tower of the church, walking where there used to be a floor. His story made me shudder as I remembered the woman outside my sister's window. And that is their story. This story comes from a Reddit user who wanted to remain anonymous. And this is their story. I've been seeing paranormal things since I was a child. I'm 17, which is not a shocker to my family, since a lot of them used to be into witchcraft. Not long ago, I was in the basement waiting for my clothes to be done in the wash cycle, so I decided to wait the remaining 5 minutes down there on one of my grandmother's old chairs. Out of the corner of my eye, I see something move. When I looked up, it looked like an old man with really long nails and sunken dark eyes, pale skin, with balding hair, and he was just watching me. When I called my mother to come down, it wasn't there anymore, so I decided not to say anything. A few weeks later, my grandmother decided to take down a wall in the basement because she started feeling like something was watching her. I then later found out that in the summer, while I was on vacation, my grandmother let a friend of hers have a funeral in our basement for her dead father. The man that the funeral was for looked exactly like the man I saw in the basement. And that is their story. That's the end of Season 2 of the Real Paranormal Stories podcast. That's all for this episode of the Real Paranormal Stories podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review anywhere this podcast can be found.